It was late August, just after sunset. I was 11 years old, and my younger brother Charlie was 8. The air was thick and warm, like it always was in those heavy summer evenings in Willow Creek, a small town known for its quiet streets and friendly neighbors. That night, we'd been outside playing hide-and-seek with the neighborhood kids until the sun dipped below the trees. When it got too dark, we finally made our way home, dirt on our knees, tired but happy. Our parents had this habit of going out to a local spot once in a while. Sometimes it was a diner on the edge of town, other times just a little place nearby. They'd usually tell us, but if we were busy outside, they'd just leave a note for us on the counter. That night, we got back, and sure enough, they weren't home. A note on the kitchen counter said they'd be back in a couple of hours. No big deal. Charlie and I settled into the living room, turned on the TV, and let ourselves unwind a bit before bed. It was just us, the quiet house, and the faint buzz of crickets outside. But then, maybe half an hour in, there was a sound that sliced through the calm. The doorbell rang, followed by a loud knock. We both froze. At first, I thought, maybe it was Mom or Dad. Maybe they forgot something. But it wasn't like them to use the front door, especially since they always had the garage opener and their key. My gut told me, something's off. I stood up, walked to the door, and heard a voice, low, gruff, and way too eager. A man called out, saying he was selling Girl Scout cookies. My heart pounded. It didn't make any sense, and every instinct told me to stay back. I cautiously peered through the peephole, and what I saw only made my stomach drop. Standing on the porch was a tall man, maybe mid-30s, completely alone, and absolutely empty-handed. No cookies, no daughter with him, nothing but a cold expression on his face. He called out again, louder, this time moving his hand slowly to the door handle. That's when it hit me. We'd forgotten to lock the door when we got in. I couldn't let him open it. I held my breath, reached out, and flicked the deadbolt shut. Click. The sound echoed louder than I intended, and I knew he heard it too. For a moment, everything went still. I looked back through the peephole, only to find him now moving away from the door, his gaze shifting to the living room window. Through the sheer curtain, he could see Charlie, oblivious, still sitting on the couch watching TV. My blood ran cold. And then, I noticed something else. A glint of metal at his waist, a gun holstered on his side. I could barely breathe, but I knew I had to get Charlie away, fast, without scaring him. Keeping my voice steady, I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey Charlie," I said, forcing a casual smile. "Let's go get some ice cream from the basement, yeah?" He looked at me, confused but eager, nodding. I led him downstairs, and as quietly as I could, I locked the basement door behind us. We sat there, eating ice cream in tense silence. I could hear every creak in the house, every distant sound outside. Time seemed to drag on, until finally, the hum of the garage door opening echoed from upstairs. My parents were home. When Charlie wasn't around, I told them everything. Their faces went pale, and my mom quickly called the police. Officers came by and inspected the house. The first thing they pointed out was that the front door lock had clear signs of tampering. It was unsettling confirmation. The man had tried to break in. Whatever he had planned, no one could say for sure. The police never found him, and he was never identified. I've been a mail carrier for about a decade now. My name's Drew, and I cover most of the routes around Weston Heights, a quiet little neighborhood, mostly. It's a job I actually enjoy, gives me a routine, some fresh air, and I get to meet a lot of interesting people along the way. But there's one day, about a year ago, that still stands out in my mind. It was, by far, the strangest, most unsettling experience I've ever had on the job. So, part of my daily route involves delivering to this small apartment complex, 4 buildings in total. They're all lined up, side by side, with a narrow road cutting between them and parking spaces squeezed in wherever there's room. It can get tight, and when all the spaces are full, I usually have to park right in the middle. Not ideal, but I try to make sure no one's completely blocked in. One morning, I pulled up and, sure enough, not a single open spot. I parked as carefully as I could, stepped out, and made my first delivery inside Building A. When I came back out, I crossed over to Building B, dropping off the next batch. But, as I was heading back to my truck, I noticed a man standing there, glaring at me, arms crossed. He looked agitated. Before I could say anything, he started yelling, "You're blocking my car. I gotta get out of here and you're in my way." His tone was hostile, and he was pacing, like he was itching for a fight. The guy looked rough, like he'd been through a long night, and maybe more than that. "Look, man," I tried to keep calm. "I left plenty of space. You should have enough room to get by." But he wasn't having it. He just kept yelling, louder, angrier. I could tell reasoning wasn't getting me anywhere, so I just said, "I'm leaving anyway. It'll only be a minute." I walked back to my truck, but he followed me, getting louder, closer. He cursed, threw insults, everything you can think of. I tried to ignore him, got in, and started to drive off. But as I pulled away, he stormed back to his car, revved the engine like he was at a racetrack, and floored it out of the lot, screeching his tires, coming within inches of my truck, and flipping me off as he sped past. All I could think was, good riddance. The next day, I was back at the complex. This time I found a spot, parked properly, and went into Building C. When I came back out to the truck, I stopped cold. The inside of my truck was a complete mess. Mail, packages, everything. Scattered across the seats. The floor. I'd had this habit of leaving my door open while I went inside. A dumb habit, I admit. But up until that point, no one had ever messed with my stuff. I didn't need to think hard about who'd done it. I gritted my teeth, spent a solid 20 minutes reorganizing everything, got myself back on schedule, and finished my route. That night, I sent an email to the apartment management about the incident. I wasn't expecting much, but they assured me they'd let the residents know. I figured that was the end of it, but a few days later, I was back there again. I'd finished delivering to Building D, and when I returned to the parking lot, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My truck's front tires, slashed, completely flat. As I took it in, I looked around and then spotted him. The same guy standing outside his building, leaning against the railing of a first-floor patio, laughing. His eyes locked onto mine, and there was this smug, satisfied look on his face. Anger got the better of me, and I stormed over. "What the hell is your problem?" I yelled, unable to keep my voice steady. He just sneered, leaned forward, and said, "Consider yourself lucky I only went after your truck. Next time, might be something else." There was this edge in his voice, a kind of coldness that set off alarms in my head. I realized then, he wasn't just some guy blowing off steam. He was unhinged. I backed away, not saying another word, and went straight to my truck to call the cops. When the officers arrived, they knew him by name. Apparently, I wasn't his first victim, not by a long shot. They arrested him right there. Turned out, he didn't even live in the complex. He was just squatting in his ex-girlfriend's place, trying to cause chaos. After that day, I never saw him again. This happened when I was 15. My name's Kyle, and for my birthday that year, my parents surprised me with an Xbox. They even got me my own monitor so I could play up in my room, something I'd been wanting for ages. My room was upstairs, and you can guess where I spent most of my time after that. One Saturday night, I was up there, talking to two of my school friends in an Xbox party chat. My parents were out of town, away for the weekend at a work conference, so I was home alone. I had the volume pretty loud, you know, zoning out with my friends, but during a pause in our game, I heard this faint thump coming from downstairs. If you've ever been home alone as a kid, you know any out-of-place sound can set your mind off, imagining the worst. I turned the volume down, lifted one headphone off my ear, and waited. At first, nothing. A minute went by, and then I heard it again. Same sound, like something shifting or bumping around. I told my friends, just casually, and of course, they egged me on, joking, saying maybe someone had broken in. Maybe it was some ghost. I laughed, shrugged it off. But when we hit a break in our game, I decided to check it out. I took my headphones off, walked out of my room, and started down the stairs. I hadn't gone halfway when I froze, hearing something new, a whisper. Soft, but definitely there, echoing up from the living room. I held my breath, listening, trying to figure out if I was just imagining it, or if there was something real down there. Slowly, I crouched down to peek around the stair railing, and my heart stopped. There were 4 men, all dressed in black, moving silently through the room. I couldn't process it. It felt unreal. All I knew in that instant was that I had to get back upstairs, quietly. I turned, creeping back up the stairs, step by step. But just as I reached the last few steps, one of them creaked. The sound echoed through the whole house, louder than anything, piercing the silence. I knew they'd heard it. Thinking fast, I ran to my room, threw on my headset, and whispered urgently to my friends, "Call the police. Right now. Send them to my address." My friends went silent, then asked what was happening, sounding worried. But I didn't have time to explain, so I just repeated, "Call the cops. Now." I tossed the headset down, knowing I couldn't stay in my room. That'd be the first place they'd look. So I locked my bedroom door, but slipped down the hallway to the bathroom, leaving the light off and the door cracked open just slightly. I barely breathed. From down the hall, I could hear heavy footsteps on the stairs, then on the landing, getting closer. My bedroom door shook as someone started pounding on it, hard. Whoever it was shouted through the door, demanding I open it, threatening that if I didn't, bad things will happen to you. Their voices were low, intense, like they meant every word. I didn't think. I just moved, slipping over to the bathroom window and slowly trying to open it, praying they wouldn't hear me. But as I started pushing the window open, the footsteps grew louder, and one of them was coming. Down the hall, straight toward the bathroom. Heart racing, I shoved the window open just enough, then dove out head first. I landed on the grass below, hard, the impact jarring through my neck. I rolled over, groaning, but looked up to see a silhouette in the bathroom window, just standing there, watching me. My mind screamed, "Run," but my body. I was still trying to get up when I heard the backyard door slide open. 3 men bolted out, sprinting toward me. I tried to push myself up, but they reached me first. They grabbed me, dragged me back toward the house. My throat was dry, panic overtaking me. Then, distant but unmistakable, I heard the wail of police sirens. The men froze, looked at each other, and without a word turned and sprinted toward the backyard fence, vaulting over it and disappearing into the night. A few moments later, the police arrived, rushing into the backyard. I pointed them toward the direction the men had gone, and some of the officers took off, while another stayed with me, asking questions. As they checked the house, my friends who had been on the Xbox chat rode up on their bikes. Even now, I thank them every time I see them. Their quick call probably saved my life. Only one of those guys was caught, the one left inside the house. The other 3 vanished, never found. Police later showed me what they'd left behind: knives, 4 of them, and 2 loaded guns. Even to this day, I sometimes think back on that night, and I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't heard them? If my friends hadn't called the police? And I realized just how close I came to never making it out of that house. I used to work as a delivery driver. I'd drive this big truck all over the city, dropping off orders, handling crates. This story happened a few years back, but honestly, it still plays vividly in my mind, like it happened just yesterday. It had been a long day, one of those shifts where every hour feels like 3. By the time I was making my final delivery for the night, it was already dark. I pulled up to this warehouse, one of those industrial places on the edge of town, where things are eerily quiet at night. I parked around back, where deliveries were supposed to be made. I'd arrived a bit early, and the back door was shut, so I had to wait. Behind the building, there was a small, dimly lit parking lot, almost completely empty, save for a few dumpsters. It was silent. That kind of silence where every sound gets amplified. As I sat there, I noticed a man walking through the back lot, almost out of place, just lingering. I got out of the truck, went up to the side door, and knocked to let them know I was there. After a bit, I went back to my truck, opened it up, and began unloading. It took maybe 10 or 15 minutes to get everything off. I did a quick check around the truck, closed it up, and got back in to head home. The drive back to the depot took about 20 minutes. It was past closing time, and I was alone in the lot, just me and the truck. I'd just parked, and I was stepping out, ready to clock out and leave, when I heard this noise. It was faint, but sharp, like a shuffling or a scuff coming from the back of the truck. That got my attention. I was the only one there, and I'd checked before closing the doors, so there shouldn't have been anyone or anything back there. Curious, but honestly, a bit on edge, I went back, unlocked the doors, and swung them open. And standing there, half hidden behind a stack of crates, was him. The man I'd seen in the lot earlier, just staring at me. As soon as the doors opened fully, he bolted, leaping out of the truck, brushing right past me. He took off running, sprinting down the street, disappearing into the shadows before I could even process what was happening. For a good while, I just stood there, staring after him, my mind racing. I'd had no idea anyone was back there, hidden behind the crates, the whole drive back. To this day, I have no idea how he managed to get in, or why. Maybe he needed a ride, maybe he had nowhere else to go, or maybe something else. I'm just glad he didn't turn out to be dangerous. Still, it remains one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me. When I was a kid, I lived right in the middle of nowhere. My family owned a small farm, and our old farmhouse sat far back from the main road, connected only by a dirt path winding through fields and trees. I must have been about 16 at the time. It was close to midnight one night, and I was home alone, sitting on the couch in our living room, watching some late-night movie. Our dog, Bear, was stretched out beside me. He was getting up there in age, not the lively pup he used to be. These days he'd lay through a whole movie, barely moving. Then, out of nowhere, Bear's ears shot up. He lifted his head, turned it, and stared dead ahead, toward the front door. I paused the movie, muted the TV, and listened. But I heard nothing, just the usual quiet. Bear stayed focused, unblinking, fixated on that door. Now, it was unusual. No one ever just showed up out here, especially at this time of night. You'd have to go way out of your way to reach us, and, well, people didn't do that. I brushed it off, thinking it must have been some animal outside, and turned the movie back on. But Bear started growling softly, eyes still locked on that door. In all the years I'd had him, he'd maybe growled twice before. This was different. By then, I felt like I needed to check it out, just to be sure. So, I grabbed one of the guns my family kept for safety, walked over, and opened the front door. I looked around, but nothing. Just blackness stretching out into the night. I decided to step outside and went about 30 yards off the porch, scanning the dark. Nothing. Just quiet. I turned to head back, took one step toward the house, and froze. Sitting, right on the edge of our deck, was a man, curled up in the fetal position, barely visible. He looked like he was trying to hide. My heart was pounding. I wasn't about to go any closer to him, so, as quietly as I could, I backed up, slipped around to the back of the house, and went in through the back door. We never really locked our doors out here, but that night, I quickly deadbolted it, then ran through the house, locking every single window and door. I called the police, and after what felt like forever, probably 30 minutes, they finally showed up. They searched the whole property, but found nothing. The officers left, assuring me it was probably just some drifter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The next morning, I went downstairs, still uneasy, and started making breakfast. But as I reached for a knife to cut some fruit, I noticed one was missing. I was certain I'd put it back the night before. That's when the dread set in. I called the police again, told them everything, and they agreed to search inside the house this time. I waited outside, pacing, my mind racing. After a few minutes, the officers came out, bringing with them an old, scrawny man in handcuffs. They'd found him hiding under the basement stairs, gripping a kitchen knife with both hands, the missing knife. It was him, the same man I'd seen outside, When questioned, he wouldn't say a word. Not a single explanation for what he was doing out there, or what he'd intended to do. The police believed that, when I circled around to the back of the house, he'd taken his chance and slipped in through the front. Back when I was working as a teacher just out of college, I picked up a summer job delivering pizzas to help make ends meet. The teaching pay wasn't great back then, especially those first few years, so when school was out, I'd deliver for Domino's. They stayed open late, so most of my shifts were night shifts, sometimes stretching into the early hours of the morning. One of those late-night deliveries turned into something I'll never forget. It all started normally enough. I loaded the pizza into my car, checked the address on the order slip, and headed out. But as I turned onto the street, something caught my eye. There were no streetlights, just darkness. On one side, a line of 4 or 5 houses spaced out along the road. On the other, thick woods, barely 10 feet from the asphalt, dark and dense. I pulled up in front of the last house, parked, and grabbed the pizza. Walking up to the front porch, I noticed the place was quiet. Too quiet. There wasn't a doorbell, so I knocked a few times, loud enough to be heard. I waited, glancing back at my car in the stillness. But no one came to the door. I couldn't just leave the pizza. We hadn't gotten paid yet. I knocked again, even louder this time, making sure whoever was inside could hear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a dim light flickered on behind the door. It creaked open, and an older man squinted out at me. He looked irritated, clearly just woken up. He muttered that he hadn't ordered a pizza. I felt bad. Must have been a mistake on the address, I thought. So, still standing on his porch, I pulled out my phone, double-checking the address against the order slip. But the address was correct. No phone number on the order either, which meant I'd have to just bring the pizza back to the store. I apologized, turned around, and headed back to my car, already thinking about the drive back. As I walked over to the passenger side to put the pizza down, something cold, hard and metallic pressed against the back of my head. My heart stopped. A voice, deep, rough, whispered from behind, "Give me everything you've got. Don't turn around." My mind went blank. I managed to pull out the cash pouch from the front seat, the one we used for deliveries, and held it out behind me. We emptied it pretty often, so there was probably only about $100 inside. He snatched it from my hand fast, his grip strong and urgent, and he gave a final warning not to follow him, then shoved me hard against the side of my car. By the time I spun around, he was already vanishing into the trees, just a dark figure slipping into the shadows. I sat there for a second, breathing hard, my mind racing. I'd never had a gun pulled on me before. I drove back to the store in silence, my hands shaking the entire way. What haunts me isn't just the robbery itself, but how carefully he'd planned it, waiting by that house, right by the woods, knowing the spot was perfect for a quick escape. All for the chance of a small sum of cash. The rest of that summer, every delivery was different. I'd glance over my shoulder before walking up to any door, and I started carrying mace just in case. And I got a lot better at keeping an eye on my surroundings. I've always been into making extra money on the side, even with a full-time job. I'd done all sorts of gigs, from Uber to Postmates, even DoorDash. Eventually, I thought I'd give Instacart a try. I'd heard good things about it and figured it'd be easy enough. One of my first Instacart orders was a big grocery delivery for a house on the outskirts of town. It was at Aldi, a store I knew well. I shopped for the order, checked out, loaded the bags into my car, and then drove to the customer's house. When I arrived, an older woman opened the door. She looked kind enough and asked if I'd be willing to help her bring the bags inside. She had a lot of groceries and I didn't mind, so I agreed and followed her into the house. She thanked me, and then she offered me a cup of tea. I wasn't planning on staying, but she insisted, said it was her way of paying me back for my help. Reluctantly, I agreed, and sat down on her living room couch while she went to make the tea. As I waited, I glanced around the living room, just taking it in. The place had that old, musty smell, with dim lighting and dusty furniture. I really needed to use the bathroom and noticed one at the end of the hall, so I figured I'd go quickly while she was in the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I happened to glance into a room, and then I stopped in my tracks. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings, strange symbols that seemed almost ritualistic. Dark, twisting shapes and lines I couldn't recognize, some of them faded, as if they'd been drawn years ago. There were candles, a lot of them, scattered across the floor, all half melted, and, hanging on one wall, were several sets of handcuffs and a whip. I was frozen, staring into this room, trying to make sense of it. This old lady I'd met seemed frail, kind even. Yet here was this bizarre space that felt so out of place in her home. I didn't even make it to the bathroom. All I wanted was to get out of that house. I turned around, headed back down the hall, and glanced toward the kitchen. She was still in there, so I quietly let myself out the front door and walked quickly to my car. As I got in and drove away, I looked back at the house one last time, and there she was, standing at the front window, her face pale and unmoving, watching me leave with this cold, dead stare. It was unsettling, to say the least. I didn't call the cops. I didn't know what I could even report. Just an odd room in an old lady's house. But from that day forward, I was a lot more cautious. I never went into anyone's house to help with their groceries again. You never really know what or who you might encounter out there.